The wedding breakfast was set for 40, and Eleanor Fenwick sat at the far end of the table in a gown she had turned twice at the seams. Around her the crystal sang with every toast, the June light catching the Ashworth silver, the roses banked along the centerpiece, so thick their scent pressed against her throat like a hand. She was, as of 9 o'clock that morning, the Countess of Ashworth. The ring on her finger was gold and old, and slightly too large, and she kept her left hand in her lap so it would not slide free and confirm what half the room already suspected, that this marriage fit her the way the gown did, which was to say barely and only by effort. At the head of the table, Marcus Hale, the Earl of Ashworth, received his guests with the economy of a man settling accounts. He had not smiled once. He had not looked at her since the church, where he had spoken his vows in a voice so level it might have been reading terms of lease. The guests nearest Eleanor spoke over her, around her, occasionally through her, the way one speaks in the presence of furniture that has been rearranged without consultation. A Mrs. Davenport on her left mentioned the weather. A Sir Harold on her right mentioned the lamb. Neither mentioned the bride. Beside the dowager's chair, Miss Sophia Whitmore sat in ivory silk and watched Eleanor with the particular stillness of a woman who had expected to be in Eleanor's seat and had not yet decided how to grieve it. Miss Whitmore's pearls caught the candlelight. Eleanor's collar was bare. The dowager herself had spoken to Eleanor exactly once since the ceremony, leaning close enough for the lavender on her collar to reach Eleanor's nose, her voice pitched to carry no further than the nearest footman. "The clergyman's daughter," she had said, as though naming a species of moth found on the curtains. "Of all the arrangements my son might have made." Eleanor had said nothing. She had learned, in the 6 months since her father's death, that silence was cheaper than pride, and lasted longer. What she had not learned, what no amount of silence could have prepared her for, was the way Marcus Hale's jaw tightened when his mother spoke, or the way his hand stilled on his glass, or the way his gaze moved to Eleanor for the first time since the vows and held there for 3 full seconds before he looked away. She did not know what that look contained. She would spend the next fortnight finding out. If this story is the kind that finds you on a difficult evening, the kind you return to when you need the world to be a little more just than it was today, you might consider staying close. Eleanor's father, the Reverend James Fenwick, had died the previous December of a fever that moved through his chest in 4 days and left behind a daughter, a rectory that belonged to the church, and debts of £400. The debts were a surprise. The Reverend had been a careful man, a man of small comforts and large libraries, and Eleanor had not known until the solicitor came that her father had been quietly paying for the schooling of 3 village children out of money he did not have. She sold the library first. The books went in crates, 40 years of annotation and marginal argument carried off by a dealer from Bath, who paid £11 for the lot and did not count the volumes. Then the piano. Then the good china that had been her mother's. Piece by piece. Each plate wrapped in the tissue paper her mother had saved from Christmases past, until the debts were settled and the rectory was empty, and she stood in the lane with a single trunk and a locket around her neck that held a miniature of her parents on their wedding day. Her mother's face no larger than a thumbnail and already beginning to fade. She had taken a position as companion to Lady Dorset in Bath. The work was tolerable. Lady Dorset was deaf in one ear and preferred Eleanor to read aloud from the same 3 novels in rotation, which meant Eleanor could let her voice carry the words while her mind carried the arithmetic of what remained. Her wages were £12 per quarter. Her shoes were wearing at the heel. Her one good shawl was borrowed, on indefinite and increasingly uncomfortable loan from Lady Dorset's housekeeper. 3 months into her service, a letter arrived from a Mr. Stratton, solicitor of Stratton and Phelps, Lincoln's Inn. The Earl of Ashworth required a wife. The requirement was not romantic. It was structural. The Ashworth entail, written by the third Earl in a fit of dynastic anxiety, stipulated that the holder of the title must be married before his 30th birthday, or the estate. Briarfield, its 12,000 acres, its tenant farms, its household of 42 souls, would pass to the nearest male relation. Marcus Hale would turn 30 on the 24th of June. It was the first of the month. The nearest male relation was a Mr. Gerald Hale, a cousin twice removed who had already engaged a surveyor to walk the grounds. Mr. Stratton's letter was precise. The Earl required a wife of gentle birth, modest expectation, and willingness to accept a contractual arrangement. £3,000 would be settled on the bride as her own. Separate lives would follow the union. Eleanor read the letter twice. She folded it into her apron pocket and returned to Lady Dorset's drawing room, where she read 40 pages of Clarissa without hearing a single word. That night she wrote her acceptance on the back of her father's last sermon notes, the only clean paper she had. She did not tell Lady Dorset what the letter contained. She did not weep. She touched the locket at her throat and thought of her mother, who had married a clergyman for love and died at 32, with nothing to show for it except a daughter who had inherited her hands and her habit of believing that honest terms were better than beautiful ones. Briarfield was larger than Eleanor had imagined and quieter than she had feared. The house was Palladian, symmetrical, built of pale stone that held the June light and gave it back as warmth. The gardens were formal and immaculate, boxwood trimmed to the inch, gravel paths raked clean enough to show a single footprint. The servants were correct. Her trunk looked very small in the entrance hall, dwarfed by the marble floor and the twin staircases and the chandelier overhead, whose crystals moved faintly in the draught from the open doors. Penrose, the housekeeper, a woman of 60 with hands that had clearly once been a working woman's hands and eyes that missed nothing, led her up the main staircase and along a corridor lined with portraits. Eleanor's eyes caught on one that had been turned to face the wall, the gilt frame visible, the canvas hidden. She did not ask. Mrs. Penrose did not explain. The housekeeper opened a door at the end of the corridor, and Eleanor stepped into the master suite. The room was large, high-ceilinged, papered in a deep green that made the evening light amber. The bed was oak and old and wide enough for 3. A writing desk stood near the window. The curtains were drawn back to show the gardens below, and beyond them, the long slope of Briarfield's Park running south toward a line of elms whose shadows were already reaching toward the house. Eleanor set down her bag. "Is there an adjoining chamber?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She had rehearsed this question in the carriage, turning the words over until they sounded like reason rather than retreat. Mrs. Penrose hesitated, and in that hesitation, Eleanor heard the shape of something she had not been told. "There is a room through that door, my lady. It has not been opened in some time." "I see. Then I shall take it, if it can be aired." "I am afraid, my lady, that his lordship has given instructions on the matter." The instructions arrived in person 20 minutes later. Marcus stood in the doorway of the master suite in his shirt sleeves, his cravat loosened, his face carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent the day performing a ceremony he had designed to feel like nothing. Eleanor stood by the window with her hands clasped. She had not unpacked. "Mrs. Penrose tells me the adjoining room is unavailable," she said. "It is." "The terms of our arrangement, my lord, were clear. Separate lives. I understood that to include separate rooms." "You understood correctly." Then where am I to sleep?" He looked at her. It was the second time that day his gaze had held on her face, and the weight of it was the same, a quality of attention that did not soften and did not relent, and did not look away when she expected it to. "Here," he said. Her pulse moved into her throat. She felt it there, visible, a small drum she could not quiet, and she pressed her fingertips to the side of her neck before she could stop herself. His eyes tracked the gesture. Something moved behind his face and was locked down before she could name it. "I will not trouble you," he said. His voice was low and level, the voice of a man issuing an order he expected to be followed. "The settee is sufficient for my purposes. You will have the bed." "My lord, this is not what was agreed." "No," he said. "It is not." He crossed the room to the wardrobe, retrieved a blanket from the top shelf, and carried it to the settee by the cold fireplace. The settee was not long enough for him. His boots would hang over the arm. He folded the blanket once and set it across the cushion, with the same precision he applied to everything, the same controlled economy that made his voice sound like a closed door, even when the words themselves were giving her the bed, the room, the space she had asked for. "Go to sleep, Mrs. Hale." He sat on the settee with the blanket across his knees and his back to her, and in the silence Eleanor heard her own breathing and the tick of the mantel clock and the sound of a house that contained, somewhere behind a locked door, a room he would not let her enter, and a reason he would not name. She found the child on the third morning. Eleanor had risen early, as was her habit, the gray light just reaching the garden, and walked the east corridor looking for the library. She opened the wrong door and found instead a nursery, sun-filled and sparse, with a rocking horse in the corner, and a rug that had been worn thin by small knees, and a shelf of wooden animals arranged with the terrible precision of a child who had no one to scatter them for her. A small girl sat on the rug with a wooden horse in each hand, crashing them together in silence. No nursemaid was present. The fire had gone cold. The child looked up. She had Marcus's eyes, gray and serious, set in a face still round with babyhood, and a mouth that had not yet learned the shape of laughter. Eleanor knelt on the rug, her skirt pooled on the cold floor. "Good morning," she said. "I am Eleanor. What are their names?" She pointed at the wooden horses. The child stared. Her fingers tightened on the smaller horse, the one with the chipped ear and the paint rubbed off its mane. Then she held it out, arm extended, and waited with the grave patience of someone who had learned that offering was not the same as receiving. Eleanor took it. They played for an hour. Eleanor built a stable out of books from the nursery shelf, and Charlotte populated it with every wooden animal she owned, arranging them by size, moving them when Eleanor moved, copying the angle of Eleanor's wrist when she walked a horse through the door. Mrs. Penrose found them there and told Eleanor, in the careful voice of a servant who has chosen her loyalties, that the child's name was Charlotte, that she was 2 years old, that her mother had died bringing her into the world, and that his lordship visited the nursery on Sundays. It was Wednesday. Eleanor looked at the wooden horse in her hand, at its chipped ear and its rubbed paint, and felt something move behind her ribs that was not pity and was not anger, and was something closer to recognition. The particular ache of knowing what it is to be in a room and not be reached for. That evening she returned to the nursery with a book of fairy stories from the library and sat in the rocking chair with Charlotte in her lap, and read aloud until the child's eyes grew heavy and her body softened against Eleanor's shoulder, and her breathing slowed to the rhythm of the story. Eleanor did not know Marcus was standing in the corridor. She did not see the way he leaned against the doorframe with one hand pressed to his mouth, his knuckles white against his lips, his eyes fixed on the child in her arms with an expression that was not coldness and was not command, and was the face of a man watching something he had given up on return without permission. He stayed for the duration of one story and the beginning of another, until the child was asleep and Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper, and he turned away before she could see his face. The next morning he appeared at the breakfast table before she did, and said, without looking at her, "You will eat something before you go to the nursery. You missed supper last night." Eleanor looked at the plate he had already filled. Toast, 2 eggs, a small pot of chocolate she had not asked for, the cup placed at exactly the angle her hand would reach for it. "I was not hungry," she said. "You were occupied," he corrected. "That is not the same thing. Sit." The word was clipped. His face was stone. His hand, resting on the back of her chair as he pulled it out, was close enough that she could feel the warmth of it through the muslin at her shoulder. She sat. She ate. She did not mention that his hand had trembled. That afternoon, the Dowager arrived at Briarfield with Miss Whitmore, 2 trunks, a lady's maid, and the serene confidence of a woman who had not yet accepted that the wedding had been anything more than a temporary inconvenience. At dinner that evening, with 12 guests seated at the long table and the candles casting the kind of light that made Miss Whitmore's pearls glow and Eleanor's plain neckline look plainer, a Mr. Kavanagh, a neighbor of some standing and some stomach, turned to Eleanor with a smile that contained exactly the right proportion of warmth and condescension, and said, "You must find it all rather grand, Lady Ashworth. Coming from a clergyman's household." The table heard it. The Dowager's mouth curved. Eleanor felt the blood leave her face and return to it in the same breath. And she was aware, without looking, of Marcus at the head of the table, of his hand tightening on his glass until the knuckle whitened, of the stillness that moved through his body like something being held by force. "I find it well run, Mr. Kavanagh," she said. "The household speaks to its management." Marcus did not speak. He set down his glass with a sound that carried. Eleanor discovered Catherine's room on a Tuesday. She had not meant to find it. Charlotte had wandered from the nursery, pulled open a door at the end of the east corridor, and stood in the light from the window with her hand on the frame. Eleanor followed and lifted her onto her hip and looked inside. The room was preserved. The bed was made, the coverlet smoothed, the pillows plumped, as though the woman who had slept there might return by evening. A dressing table still held a silver brush with a strand of dark hair caught in its bristles, a hand mirror, a ribbon of blue silk draped over the mirror's handle. On the mantel, a small framed watercolor of a woman with dark hair and a kind, open face, and a mouth that smiled as though she had just been told something unexpected and delightful. Charlotte reached for the watercolor. Her fat hand opened and closed. "Mamma," she said. It was the first word Eleanor had heard her speak. Eleanor closed the door. She carried Charlotte back to the nursery and sat in the rocking chair and held her and rocked until the trembling in her own hand stopped and the child's grip on her sleeve loosened into sleep. That night, lying in the wide bed while Marcus sat on the settee with a book he had not turned a page of in 20 minutes, Eleanor said into the darkness, "The room you will not give me," was hers. The silence was long enough for the clock to mark it. "Yes," he said. "You might have told me." "I might have." She heard the creak of the settee as he shifted his weight, and then, in a voice Eleanor had not heard from him before, a voice stripped of rank and command, and the particular discipline that held his face like a mask he had worn so long he had forgotten the effort of it. He said, "Catherine died in that bed, 2 years ago, in November. The child came early. The physician arrived late. I was in the corridor. I heard everything through the door, and I could do nothing. And when it was over, I walked into that room, and I picked up my daughter. And I have not walked into it since." Eleanor's eyes were open in the dark. She could hear his breathing, slower now, ragged at the edges, as though the words had cost him something physical, something he had been carrying in his chest and had set down on the floor between them. "You married her for love," Eleanor said. It was not a question. "I married her because I could not imagine a life that did not contain her. I was wrong. The life came anyway." The words hung in the dark between them. He did not say what they both understood, that he had married Eleanor for the opposite reason, that this marriage was designed to contain nothing at all, and that the design was failing. Eleanor pressed her hand to the locket at her throat and felt the faint ridge of the miniature inside it, her mother's face, her father's face, the two of them together in a space no larger than a coin. She did not speak again. In the morning she found that he had placed a cup of chocolate on the table beside the bed, still warm, before he left the room. The cup was set at exactly the angle her hand would reach for it. If you have listened this long, if Eleanor's composure has asked something of you that you recognize, you might already know what is being built in the silence between these two people. Stay and watch it arrive. The following week, Miss Whitmore walked with Eleanor in the garden and said, in a voice that was not unkind, and was therefore worse, "You must understand, Lady Ashworth, that his mother will not rest. She believes you are temporary. She believes the annulment will come as soon as the entail is satisfied, and that a proper match will follow." Eleanor looked at the roses. They were the deep red of something that refused to be modest. "And what do you believe, Miss Whitmore?" "I believe Marcus Hale does not do temporary things." It was the most honest sentence anyone had spoken to Eleanor since her arrival, and it came from the woman who had expected to be in her place. Eleanor carried those words with her through the rest of the day, through the morning visit to Charlotte, through the afternoon when Marcus found her in the library and said, without explanation, "Walk with me." And they walked the south garden in silence. His stride shortened to match hers, his hand occasionally brushing the hedge as they passed it, until they reached the end of the path, and he stopped and looked at the elms and said, "She would have liked the garden. She never saw it in June." Eleanor did not ask who. She stood beside him and felt the heat of the afternoon on her skin and the awareness of exactly where his arm was in relation to hers, 3 inches of warm air that neither of them closed. That evening, the Dowager hosted a supper at Briarfield, to which she had invited every family of consequence within 15 miles. She seated Miss Whitmore at Marcus's right hand and Eleanor at the far end of the table beside the vicar's wife. She wore her diamonds. Eleanor wore her mother's locket. The contrast was visible to everyone in the room, and intended to be. At the end of the meal, the Dowager rose and delivered a speech about the Ashworth legacy, about the duty of the title, about the importance of a match worthy of the name, and in the pause before she sat down, she looked directly at Eleanor, and the room followed her gaze, and Eleanor felt the weight of 30 pairs of eyes, and the particular silence that forms when a verdict is being delivered without a trial. After supper, in the corridor outside the drawing room, Eleanor heard the Dowager's voice through the half-open door. She had not meant to stop. Her feet stopped for her. The arrangement was expedient, nothing more. Gerald Hale would have been worse, I grant you that. She served her purpose. The clergyman's daughter served her purpose. When the terms are met and the estate is safe, we shall see to the rest. Eleanor's hand found the wall. Her fingers pressed against the cold plaster, and her knees softened, and she stood there in the dark corridor until the shaking resolved itself into something she could walk on. She went to the nursery. She held Charlotte. She sang the lullaby her mother had taught her, the one about the river and the small boat and the lantern at the far shore, and when Marcus appeared in the doorway, she did not look up, because she knew that if she looked at him, she would ask him whether it was true, whether she was temporary, whether the contract that had brought her here contained somewhere in its careful language the shape of her eventual removal. He stood there for a long time. Then he said quietly, "Come inside, Eleanor. It is cold." It was the first time he had used her name. She heard it in his voice the way she had once heard her father read a passage he loved, the slight catch, the deliberate wait, as though the word itself had cost him something he had not planned to spend. The morning of the midsummer ball, 3 days before his 30th birthday, the dowager struck. Eleanor descended the stairs to find the entrance hall occupied by Mr. Gerald Hale, a florid man with a surveyor's eye and a solicitor's patience, and beside him, a solicitor she did not recognize, a thin man in a dark coat who held a document the way one holds a weapon one has been told will work. Mr. Gerald Hale presented the document to Marcus with the confidence of a man who had been promised this moment by someone whose promises had always been kept. The document contested the validity of the marriage. It cited the haste, the absence of banns, the suspicion of a fraudulent arrangement designed solely to circumvent the entail. If upheld, the marriage would be annulled. The estate would pass to Gerald. Eleanor would be returned to her former circumstances with nothing. The dowager stood at the top of the stairs in her mourning dress and watched the scene below with the composure of a woman who had arranged every piece on the board and was waiting for the game to end on her terms. Eleanor read the document. Her hands did not shake. She read every line, the legal phrases and the accusations, and the signature at the bottom that was not Gerald's and bore the Ashworth seal, which meant the dowager had provided it. She set the document on the hall table and looked at Marcus. His face was the face she had first seen at the wedding breakfast, closed and hard and emptied of everything she had begun, against all her private caution, to believe she had seen there. He looked at her. He said nothing. She waited. He looked at his mother. He looked at the document. He said nothing. The silence was the worst sound Eleanor had ever heard. She climbed the stairs. She passed the dowager without a word. She passed the portrait that was still turned to the wall, and the door to Catherine's room that was still closed, and the corridor where she had heard him speak his dead wife's name in the dark, and she went to the master suite and opened her trunk and began to fold her things with the same careful precision her mother had used to wrap the Christmas china, each piece handled as though it mattered even when it was being given away. She would not stay where she was a liability. She would not remain in a house that had been built to hold someone else and had only borrowed her shape for the space of 3 weeks. The locket swung against her collarbone as she bent over the trunk. She pressed it flat with her palm and held it there. And the miniature inside was warm from her skin. Her mother's face, her father's face, together in a space no larger than a coin, and both of them gone. She closed the trunk. She fastened the clasps. She put on her coat and her gloves, and she carried the trunk to the top of the stairs. And she stood there for 1 breath, 2, 3, looking down at the entrance hall where the ball guests were already arriving, and the candles were already lit, and the house was full of people who had come to see the Ashworths, and would instead see this. The entrance hall was bright with candles and voices, and the particular hum of a county gathering that senses something is about to happen. Eleanor reached the bottom of the stairs with her trunk in her hand and her coat buttoned to the throat, and the room noticed her at once. Conversations thinned. Heads turned. Mr. Gerald Hale stood near the fireplace with his solicitor, both of them holding glasses they had not yet tasted. The dowager had descended and positioned herself beside Miss Whitmore, near the drawing-room doors, her diamonds catching the light, her posture carrying the certainty of a woman whose arrangement had finally arrived at its conclusion. Miss Whitmore's face, Eleanor noticed, held something that was not triumph. It was closer to dread. It was the face of a woman who had said, "Marcus Hale does not do temporary things," and now feared she might have been wrong. Mr. Kavanagh was there with his wife. The vicar's wife stood by the window. Mrs. Penrose stood at the edge of the hall, with her hands clasped and her chin raised and her eyes bright. Eleanor set down her trunk at the foot of the stairs. She did not look for Marcus. She looked at the room, at the faces that had watched her arrive 3 weeks ago in a turned gown and had decided in the space of a single meal who she was and what she was worth. She straightened her shoulders. She had her mother's hands and her father's habit of believing that honest terms were better than beautiful ones. And the honest terms were these. She had married a man to save his home. She had held his daughter. She had slept in the bed his first wife died in and woken each morning to the sound of his breathing across the room and the quiet evidence, left in warm chocolate and filled plates and shortened commands, that something lived in this arrangement that neither of them had contracted for. She had done nothing wrong. She would leave standing. "Eleanor." His voice came from the corridor behind the staircase. She turned. Marcus Hale, the Earl of Ashworth, crossed the entrance hall in 4 strides. He was not wearing his coat. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and his hair was disordered, and his face was open in a way she had never seen it in public, in a way she had only seen it once, in the dark. When he had told her about Catherine, he was holding, in his right hand, a sheaf of papers. He stopped in front of her. The room was silent. The candle nearest his face guttered and threw his shadow across the floor and across the trunk at her feet, and across the face of his mother, who had not moved. "Her name is Lady Ashworth," he said. His voice was level, and it carried to every corner of the hall, not raised, not shaking. The voice of a man who had learned that the minimum sufficient force is always enough when the force is true. And she stays. The silence held for 2 full seconds. Then he turned to Mr. Gerald Hale. "Your petition fails. The marriage was performed by special license obtained by my solicitor, Mr. Stratton, on the 12th of May, witnessed by 2 peers of the realm, and recorded in the parish register of St. Martin's on the date of the ceremony. Mr. Stratton has the documents here." He held up the papers. Mr. Stratton, who had materialized from the study with the quiet precision of a man who had been waiting for precisely this moment since breakfast, carried the documents to Gerald's solicitor and placed them in his hands with a small nod that said everything legal language could not. Gerald's solicitor read the first page. His face changed. He leaned toward Gerald and spoke in his ear, and Gerald's confidence, which had been borrowed confidence, the kind a man wears when a dowager has dressed him in it, fell away from his face like something that had never quite fit. The dowager's hand moved to the diamonds at her throat. Her fingers closed around them and did not release. "Marcus," she said. Her voice, for the first time since Eleanor had known her, did not carry. It cracked at the edges like plaster in a room that has shifted on its foundation. "You cannot mean to continue this. It is not an arrangement, Mother." He did not raise his voice. He did not look at her. He looked at Eleanor, and his face, which had been stone and discipline, and the particular emptiness of a man who had decided 2 years ago not to feel, was none of those things. It was the face of a man standing in a doorway listening to a lullaby. "It is a marriage." Miss Whitmore moved first. She touched the dowager's arm, a small, firm gesture, and said quietly enough that only the nearest guests heard, "Let it be, Lady Ashworth. He has chosen." The dowager's mouth opened. closed. Her hand released the diamonds. She looked at Eleanor across the length of the hall, and in her eyes Eleanor saw not hatred, not defeat, not the kind of recognition the crowd would later call a reckoning. She saw a woman whose script had worked everywhere except here, and who was only now, in the silence of a room full of witnesses, beginning to understand that the error was not in the casting. It was in the script. Mrs. Penrose was crying. She was doing it silently, with her chin still raised, which was exactly how Eleanor would have expected her to do it. Mr. Kavanagh cleared his throat and said to the vicar's wife, loud enough for the room to mark it, "Well, I believe that is settled." Eleanor looked at Marcus. He was still holding the papers. His hand, the one not holding the papers, was at his side, open, the fingers slightly extended, as though he had been about to reach for her, and had stopped himself because the room was watching. And he was a man who had spent 2 years stopping himself. She picked up her trunk. She set it beside the staircase. She unfastened her coat. She took it off and folded it over the trunk and stood in her plain dress in front of the whole room and did not look away from him. His hand closed, opened, reached. That night, long after the last carriage had rolled down the drive and the candles in the hall had been put out one by one, and the house had settled into its particular late silence, Eleanor sat in the master suite by the fire, with Charlotte asleep in her lap. The child had refused to go to her nursery. She had found Eleanor in the corridor after the ball, and lifted her arms and said in her small, serious voice, the second word Eleanor had ever heard from her, "Stay." Marcus came in quietly. He had put on his coat at some point during the evening and taken it off again, and his cravat was gone entirely, and he looked, in the firelight, like a man who had set down something very heavy and had not yet remembered how to stand without the weight of it. He did not go to the settee. He stood by the mantel and looked at the fire, and then at Eleanor, and then at Charlotte, whose hand curled around the edge of Eleanor's sleeve and held, even in sleep. "The room," Eleanor said. "Catherine's room. You will want it kept as it is." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "I will have it opened tomorrow. Mrs. Penrose will see to it. The brush and the mirror and the watercolor will go to Charlotte when she is old enough to want them. You do not have to." "I know." He looked at the fire. The light moved across his face, softening the jaw she had thought was stone, warming the gray of his eyes until they were the color of smoke thinning into air. "She would have liked you," he said. "She would have liked who Charlotte is becoming. She would have told me I was an idiot for sleeping on the settee." Eleanor's hand went to the locket at her throat. She pressed it once, the way she always did, and the miniature inside was warm from her skin. "My mother married a clergyman for love," she said. "She had nothing when she died. She was happy." "Eleanor." "Yes. I am not going to sleep on the settee tonight." She looked at him. He looked at her. Charlotte stirred and murmured and settled, and the fire cracked once and sent a scatter of sparks against the grate. And outside the window, the June darkness lay across Briarfield's 12,000 acres, across the gardens and the tenant farms and the pale stone walls that held the day's heat and gave it back as warmth. And the elms at the edge of the park stood black against a sky that was not quite dark, because midsummer in England never fully surrenders the light. In the master suite, the clock ticked its steady measure. The locket at Eleanor's throat was warm. Inside it, her mother's face was no larger than a thumbnail, and still fading. And it did not matter, because some things do not need to be seen to be kept. Marcus crossed the room. He sat beside her on the settee where he had slept for 3 weeks, rather than let her disappear into the arrangement he had built to protect himself from precisely this. Charlotte's hand released Eleanor's sleeve and found, without waking, the edge of his cuff instead. He did not move. He did not speak. He stayed. Thank you for staying until the end. If Eleanor's journey held a moment that stayed with you, leave a quiet word about what it was.